I want to start off by setting up a scene that I think we can all relate to. Think back to the last time you sat an exam. For some of us, it might have been quite a while ago. You studied the relevant material because you wanted to do well. You read the textbook, you engaged with the revision materials. Then you copied some notes. Maybe even highlighted those notes and reread the textbook multiple times. Then you sit the exam and you ace it. You clearly learned something, right? But what if you were asked to sit that same exam a week later? What about 3 months later? How well do you think you would have done? Studies have shown that a significant amount of knowledge is lost when students are asked to resit the same test several months after the initial one, sometimes by more than 50%. So why do the study techniques that we most often use lead to this dramatic loss in knowledge retention? That's what this video will answer. I'm going to explain what happens in your brain when you learn. And if you stick around to the end, I'll give you some simple study techniques that will instantly make you a more effective learner who's capable of cementing knowledge in your long-term memory so you can access it whenever you need it. So what happens in your brain when you learn? There are 3 interconnected stages to learning that need to be understood. They are encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. Stage 1, encoding. The first thing your brain needs to do when learning something new is to encode it by creating memory traces. Effectively, this means that your brain needs to create some kind of mental representation of the information that you've just received. It needs to figure out a way to interpret whatever you've just seen, experienced, or read and make sense of it in your brain. One way you could visualize this is to imagine there's a little tiny person in your brain, your encoder, who is constantly taking notes whenever you encounter information. Your encoder writes down everything, whether it's important or not. Once they write the information down, it's stored temporarily in your short-term or working memory. As a result of your encoder's meticulous need to write down notes about everything, your brain is flooded with information. Your encoder's strength is that they are able to take notes at an incredible pace. Every single bit of information you encounter gets written down. The encoder has a couple of big weaknesses though. They don't know the difference between information that's important and worth remembering and information that's completely useless. And they don't really care if you remember the information either. They just print everything and are happy to let it sit in your short-term memory. If it was up to them, you wouldn't remember anything for very long. This brings us to the second stage of learning, consolidation, where our brain strengthens these memory traces to form more concrete knowledge and transfer information that's worth remembering from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. Think of your long-term memory like a massive series of filing cabinets, where everything your encoder spits out eventually gets filed. There's a second person in your brain, the consolidator, whose job it is to pick up the pieces of paper that are thrown around by the encoder and then has to decide where to file them. The consolidator, they're not in a rush like the encoder is, and this process can take several hours or even days. In fact, the consolidator often prefers peace and quiet, so they often get some of their best work done while you and your encoder are asleep and no new pieces of paper are being printed out. Your consolidator will give meaning to the information that you've encountered, fill in blank spots, and most importantly, make connections to past experiences and other knowledge that you've already got stored in your long-term memory. The problem comes when your consolidator can't make a connection between new information that they're encountering and anything else that's in your long-term memory. They can't figure out where to file it. The consolidator doesn't have all day, so if they can't find an easy place to put it, they might put it in the wrong place, or they might be so confused they throw it in the rubbish and move on to the next piece of information. So that's it, right? We encounter new information, and then, with varying degrees of success, this information gets categorized and stored in our long-term memory. Well, that's all we need to do if we never want to access that information ever again. But true learning involves the ability not just to store things securely in our long-term memory, but to ensure that that information is at hand so we can recall it when needed. This is called retrieval. When we need to recall something that we've got stored in our long-term memory, our brain enlists the help of a third person, the retriever. Their job is to navigate the massive filing system that our consolidator has put together and locate information as it's needed. When the information is filed properly, then the process of retrieval is much easier because they know exactly where to go. Every time the retriever needs to find a piece of information, they leave behind something called a retrieval cue, something that helps them locate it more easily next time. Now, I'm sure you can see where the problem can arise. What if the consolidator has put the information in a spot that's hard to find or far away? And what about those bits of information that they had absolutely no idea where to put? You know, the ones they subtly threw in the rubbish when no one was looking. Well, in these cases, the retrieval is either very difficult or impossible, and you have to start the whole process of learning over again. A lot of times when we're trying to learn something, whether this be an exam or something for school, or when we're trying to learn something new in our lives, we implement strategies that make the job of our encoder easier. This might be highlighting information as we read it, so our encoder knows exactly what to write down. But remember, our encoder writes down everything, so highlighting isn't that useful. Another common strategy might be to reread the same information or rewatch the same information over and over again. This might be when you're cramming for an exam or trying to learn something quickly. If this happens, your encoder will take down the same notes multiple times, and this can feel like you're learning really effectively. But remember, your encoder is just storing things in short-term memory. These pieces of paper are just put on the floor right next to each other. Your consolidator is going to come along and pick them all up at exactly the same time. So the fact that there are multiple bits of the same information filed away together isn't actually that useful. When thinking about ways to optimize learning, you really should be focused on helping out your consolidator or your retriever. You can help your consolidator by making obvious links between the new thing that you're learning and things you already know. That way, they'll know where to put it. You could do this by actively considering how new information relates to something that you've done before. You could elaborate on new information, which will help you draw these connections out and make them more obvious. Or you could rewrite the information in your own words, rather than copying notes or just highlighting, so that your encoder puts it down in language that your consolidator understands. All of these things feel harder than rereading the same information or doing the same thing again. Because it feels hard, we don't think it's effective, but really, the fact that it is more difficult is actually a sign that you're learning more effectively. When thinking of ways to study, you could think about helping your consolidator rather than your encoder, but ultimately, the best way to help our brains learn things properly is to think of ways to help our retriever set up good retrieval cues. Remember, if your retriever has to access the same information multiple times, ideally spaced out over short periods of time, then they're going to become much more efficient at locating that information in your filing system. This is why using things like flashcards, completing practice quizzes or practice tests are much better study methods than just rereading the textbook or highlighting some notes. You're going to get your retriever good at finding the information that you need so that the knowledge is stored in your long-term memory and it's easily accessible when you need it. So there you go. In a nutshell, that's what happens in your brain when you learn. If you can think about ways to help your brain consolidate and retrieve information, you'll be far better off than the majority of people who focus on simpler forms of study that help the encoder record the same information over and over again in exactly the same way. This series aims to really dive deep into ways to learn effectively, so we're going to apply these principles in future videos and set out clear strategies for learning things faster, more efficiently, and with greater accuracy. If you found this video useful, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel to grow. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel.